Alright, so this is just going to be a quick review of the material for Exam 1. So remember that Exam 1 is going to be multiple choice, true, false, and matching. But once you open it, you'll need to complete it in one setting. So once you open it, you'll have 75 minutes to finish it in one session. And let me know if you have any questions as you are studying. So Exam 1 is going to cover all the material up until this point. So we had our brief introduction. We talked about the definition of educational psychology. Basically, we're talking about taking the principles of psychology and applying them to an educational setting. We talked about how we can use what we know about psychology to improve our teaching. That there are aspects of teaching that are more on the art side, but there are also aspects that are more on the science side. So on the science side, we have research that informs our practices to make sure that we are giving children the best possible education. But then there's also an art to it that gets better with time, that gets better with practice and with experience. So then our first full lecture video primarily focused on research methods. We said that research is important in every area, but especially important in education so that we can make sense of all the different opinions and different ideas about ways that children should be educated. We can really look at what works and what does not work in an objective way. So we have the scientific method approach or scientific research approach. Basically, you conceptualize the problem, come up with the idea that we need to work on. And then from there, you're going to choose what kind of research you're going to do. Somehow you're going to collect data and then analyze that data, and from there make decisions about your overall overarching theory. So a theory is a big picture idea. Typically, theories are what drive our research. We go into our research projects looking to add support to our theory, perhaps. So we take a look at our results and say, okay, based on what we found, does our theory still seem to be accurate? Is there some way that we could improve upon our theory? Now, we talked about three major types of research. We talked about descriptive or observational research. We talked about correlational research and experimental research. Any of these three could be appropriate depending on what your goal is. So it's not that one type of research is better than another. It's just that they give you different kinds of information. So descriptive research is research that allows you to get ideas. It's research that lets you describe, and that's the goal, to describe what kinds of phenomenon, what kinds of behaviors are going on right now. And then once you have that information, you might choose to then progress to correlational or experimental research after that. So we talked about different types of descriptive research, about how we could do archival analysis, where we study documents, journals, newspapers, test scores, textbooks, that kind of thing. We also talked about how you could do naturalistic observation, how you can do case studies, how you can really, with observation, the best thing to do is to get as close to the source as possible. But if you have to look at archives, look at data, look at other information, that's also there for you. The great thing about descriptive research is that because you often have a small sample size, you can really dig in and get a lot of information. So a benefit here is that it can give you good ideas. It can give you information that then leads to other types of research. But the problem with descriptive research is that we're not satisfied with just describing most of the time. We don't want to just know what's happening. We want to know why something is happening, and you can't figure that out with descriptive research. Also, when you're talking about descriptive research with a small sample size, like for example a case study with only one or two people in it, the problem there is that the results that you find may not generalize. In other words, what's true of your very small sample size may not be true of other situations and other people. So then after descriptive research or observational research, we talked about correlational research, about how we're saying that there are two variables that go together. They are co-related. So the goal of correlational research is to allow for prediction. If you know how two things go together, and then you know one of those things, you can predict the other. So if you know the relationship between class attendance and grades, and then you know the class attendance for a particular class, you can predict their grades. Or if you knew their grades, you could predict their class attendance. Not perfectly, but you can do a pretty good job there. Now, the benefits here, obviously, correlational research tells us something with prediction, but One of the great things about correlational research is that it's relatively simple, straightforward. You can do correlational study in an afternoon perhaps. It doesn't take very long to get information, for example, on class attendance and grades, and pretty simple to go through that process. The problem with correlational research is that just like with descriptive research, it does not tell you causation. You have to do experimental research to determine causation. So although I can say there's a relationship between class attendance and grades, and I can make a prediction of one based on the other, I can't say that your attendance caused your grade or your grade caused your attendance. You can't do causation with correlational research. Now, one thing we did note was the strength and the direction of correlations. So the strength refers to the number. A correlation can be assigned a strength or a number anywhere between 0 and 1. So a correlation of 0 means that the two variables are not related at all. A correlation of 1 is a perfect correlation. They always go together in the same way. Both of those are fairly rare. You'll find the numbers usually more in between 0 and 1. So maybe a correlation of 0.7 or 0.8 would be fairly strong correlations versus something like a correlation of 0.2 or 0.3. So the stronger the correlation, the better the prediction. And the strength is determined by the number. So when it tells you that this correlation is 0.9, that's a strong correlation. A 0.9 correlation is stronger than a 0.7 correlation, for example. And that is true regardless of the direction. So when we talk about direction in just a second, we're talking about positive and negative. So if you have a positive 0.4 correlation and a negative 0.4 correlation, they have the same strength. If you have a negative 0.4 correlation and a positive 0.3 correlation, the negative 0.4 correlation is stronger. You don't look at the sign, you only look at the number. The stronger the correlation, the higher the number, the closer the number is to 1. So then what does the direction tell you if it doesn't tell you anything about the strength? Well, if it's a positive correlation, that means the two variables go together in the same direction. As one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. A negative correlation means that they are moving in opposite directions. So as one goes up, the other goes down. One goes down, the other goes up. Okay? So experimental research has the goal of determining causation. It's the only type of research that allows us to do that. So of course that is a major benefit here. In psychology, we want to answer the question why. However, the drawbacks here, experimental research requires a lot more effort. There's a lot more to think about, a lot more work to do, perhaps requiring more funding, more time. So experimental research is more difficult to do, but in addition to that, it's also potentially unethical at times. So, for example, if I wanted to study the attention span of someone who smokes cigarettes, well, I can't randomly assign in my experiment some people into a smoking condition and some people into a non-smoking condition. It's not ethical for me to say, because I flipped a coin, you're in this group, you have to start smoking, and because I flipped a coin, you have to stop smoking. You can't do that kind of research. So not everything can be studied through experiments. Sometimes we have to do correlational research. All right. So some of the terminology here, your population would be all the individuals you're interested in studying. You can't get them all to be in your study though, so you have to select a sample. A sample is a subset of the population that you hope represents the population. So all the variables that are important you want to have equally reflected in your sample versus your population. So if we're interested in college students, for example, we'd want to have in our sample the same, roughly the same breakdown of different classes. So are you freshman, sophomore, junior, senior? Usually on a college campus, they're more freshmen than anything else, that kind of thing. You would not want to have a sample that was all seniors because then that wouldn't represent the overall college population. So you want to get a good sample, and the best way to do that is to use random sampling, where you randomly select sample from the population where every person in the population had an equal chance of being chosen. That will typically give you the best sample. Once you get your random sample, then you randomly assign them into groups. And in the simplest experiment, there'll be an experimental group and a control group, where the experimental group gets the treatment. They get whatever the new thing is. The control group either gets nothing, or they get whatever they already had, or potentially a placebo, a fake pill or a fake treatment, that kind of thing. Now, you see the IV and DV here. IV stands for independent variable. It's the thing that you manipulate as the researcher. So if you give a real medication to the experimental group and a fake medication to the control group, the type of pill that you received is the independent variable because it's what the researchers manipulated. The dependent variable is what the researchers measured. It's your outcome variable. It's really what you're interested in the research study. So when we're talking about developmental research studying how people change over time, we can do something called cross-sectional research, or we could do longitudinal research. So with both situations, you're studying how people change over time, but the difference is that with cross-sectional research, on one particular day, you go in and you get, for example, a group of kindergartners. You get a sample of kindergartners, and you go in and you get a sample of fifth graders, and then you can look at the differences between them. Now, in this situation, the kindergartners and the fifth graders are different people, different individuals. The benefit there is that you get to get your data and then do your research, do your statistics all on the same day without having to wait for your kindergartners to grow up into fifth graders, that kind of thing. On the other hand, with longitudinal research, you would go in and collect your data from your kindergartners and then wait. Maybe you would continue to collect data from them every year, or just wait until they're fifth graders and then get the data again. Of course, that is a great way to do research because you get a lot of information when you have the exact same people in each condition. However, as you might imagine, that's hard research to do. You have to wait a really long time to get everything that you need. And also sometimes people will drop out of that research. People will move, people will stop going to that particular school or whatever. So it may be hard for you to keep track of all of your participants over a long time span. And then finally, we talked about different types of research that might actually happen in the classroom, whether that be evaluating the effectiveness of a particular program, whether that be trying to solve a particular problem in the classroom. Maybe you have a particular student that's misbehaving and you're trying to figure out the right way to handle that. Or with a teacher as researcher, maybe you're keeping some statistics on your own performance, maybe some test scores, maybe some teacher evaluations or whatever, and looking to see if there are things that you can improve, trying to make your teaching as best that it can be. All right, and then we talked about cognitive development. We introduced this during the research lecture, but then talked more about it during the next lecture as well, that with development, this is a combination of things like cognitive, physical, and socio-emotional development that's going to begin at conception and going to end at the end of your life. So there's never a time where you've finished developing or you've stopped developing until your life is over. So we talked about different periods of development. You can look back at that. We talked about how as we get older, there are certain skills that are kind of acquired during certain time periods. Like, for example, in that middle childhood up until late childhood, that's where you're getting your school skills, right? That's where you're learning math. That's where you're learning how to read, those kinds of things. There are certain periods of development where you are expected to acquire certain skills. And then age ranges that are associated. One thing that we did mention there is that sometimes there is debate over when a period of development starts and when it finishes. Like, for example, with adolescence, there's not exactly a set time of when you are no longer a child and you are now an adolescent. Some people might say 13, some people might say 12, some people might say younger or older. And then when does adolescence end? Is it over at 18? Is that when you maybe start emerging adulthood? Or does adolescence maybe finish when you're 20, when you're no longer technically a teenager? So there may be some debate over that. We talked about developmental issues, about how nature versus nurture is basically your genetics and your biology versus your environment. So parenting, peers, media, culture, those would all be examples of nurture. And how oftentimes the answer is both. Although there may be some situations where if, for example, a person has a very serious medical condition that impacts them greatly, then you might say, well, that was a nature situation. That was a genetic situation where they were impacted more. If a person has maybe a horrible childhood, abuse and neglect and that kind of thing, then we might say they were more influenced by their environment. Typically, the answer is both. We talked about continuous versus discontinuous development, about how with continuous development, this is the idea that we are always developing and it's so gradual that we usually don't see big changes, that you grow a little bit every day, you develop a little bit every day. And so when you go from one period to the next period, you might not actually be able to know. It's not like you wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm an adolescent today, and I'm fundamentally different than I was yesterday. On the other hand, discontinuous development is the idea that you're not gradually developing all the time. It's more like a stair step. So you start on this step and you stay about the same until, for whatever reason, maybe you're biologically ready or whatever, you jump up to that next stage. So it's that stair step process here. Now, discontinuous development also does have some research support. And as a parent or as someone who has spent time around kids, you might see this, where it feels like one day they were not potty trained and the next day they were. I think that some kids tend to do this more than others, and there's individual differences there. And then we talked about early versus later experiences. Are you more impacted by your childhood, or is it possible that kids are resilient and then as we get older we become more set in our ways, and then later experiences maybe impact us more? We talked about how splintered development refers to the idea that within a particular individual, there will probably be different levels of maturity with different skills. So thinking academically, you'll probably be in a different place with your reading than you are with your math, for example. And it may also be that a person is in a different place with their academic skills and their social skills as well, and this is actually pretty typical during childhood. All right. We talked about the different parts of the neuron. So neurons, nerve cells, make up our nervous system, connecting our brain to the rest of our bodies. The way that they pass messages would be that those messages would come in through the dendrites. The dendrites are those spiky projections around the cell body. Message comes in the dendrite, goes down the axon to the terminal junctions or the terminal buttons at the end of the neuron. And then because the neurons are not actually physically touching each other, the message is passed through chemicals, neurotransmitters, that are released from the end of the neuron, from those terminal junctions or terminal buttons. They cross the synapse, which is that little gap in between, and they bind to the receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron. Now, when it talks about myelination here, this is talking about the process of coating the axons in a myelin sheath, which is just a fatty substance. And as myelination increases, the speed of transmission increases as well. So myelination is a process that is not complete at birth. It's actually still continuing on through adolescence. Now, of course, there are certain medical conditions that can impact this. Multiple sclerosis as an example. All right, so we talked about how the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe of the brain, controls things like your attention span and your decision making and your personality, and about how the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe is not fully developed until age 25-ish. And we talked about the right and left hemispheres of the brain. We said that you have 4 major lobes, right? Occipital, frontal, temporal, and parietal, and that you have those lobes on each half of the brain, but that does not mean that the right and the left brain are perfect copies of each other. There are some structures that are different. For example, the left hemisphere does have some language structures that are not found on the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is thought to be involved more in like verbal processing versus nonverbal processing more on the right side. However, having said that, the vast majority of people are going to be using both halves of their brain. We have seen that the brain is a very versatile organ, and that if, for example, a person has trauma to one part of their brain, to a certain extent, other parts of the brain may be able to take over those functions, especially when it happens during childhood, when everything is a little bit more pliable. Plasticity is what that's referred to as. All right, and then with Piaget, we talked about how he was a developmental psychologist, and his theories basically focusing on cognitive development in children suggested that we go through these stages, these discontinuous periods where you are in a period and then when you finish that time, you're ready to jump up to the next one and you have a drastic change. So it looks like a stair step. So Piaget had the different stages, and sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational, and you would go through those in a particular order based on your time period. So birth to 2 years, 2 to 7, so on and so forth. Now, some criticisms of Piaget would be that he had a very rigid idea of when we go through these stages based on age rather than on maturity level. And we know that some children acquire skills earlier than others. We know that the environment does matter as far as a child being taught these things. So it's possible that we should view Piaget as more of a general rule of thumb, but we know that there are some individual differences. Now, we talked specifically about the different stages and about skills that are developing and limitations that might still be there. So, for example, we talked about with pre-operational kids about how it's more intuitive. Logic is not there as much yet, and so they may have problems with things like classification, conservation, that kind of thing. We also talked about Vygotsky and his theory about the zone of proximal development, the idea that you need to keep children in this particular sweet spot so that they are capable of learning. That if you spend too much time on tasks that can be accomplished alone, then the individual won't actually develop, won't actually mature or learn anything new. But if you spend time on tasks that cannot be mastered even with the teacher's help, then you're wasting your time, probably producing some frustration, some anxiety. So instead, what we want to do for each individual child, as much as possible, is to identify that area where they are not capable of doing the next step on their own, but they can do it with just a little bit of help from a teacher or a parent or a more competent other person. And so once they start doing that and they start learning it, then you can gradually withdraw your help. And this is what it's referring to here as scaffolding. You give help that is appropriate. So when the task is new and not well learned, then you have to provide more help. But if you continue to provide that too much, then the child or the individual might become dependent on the scaffolding and not be able to do it independently. So you do need to withdraw that. So obviously Vygotsky has a strong emphasis on nurture here. Your zone of proximal development, this whole concept flies out the window if you're by yourself. You cannot learn something without the more competent person helping you. So obviously nurture is going to be important. One of the biggest criticisms of Vygotsky is that it's a very generalized theory that does not have specific stages or age ranges, but that could also be a benefit because that makes it flexible. We can keep this general idea in mind and apply it to many different situations. And then we briefly discussed language. We talked about how this is a system of symbols that someone has made up and that we all agree upon. We talked about how the basic building blocks of language would be the phonemes. This is phonics. This is studying the sounds that the letters make. A sound that a letter makes does not have any meaning to it, but it is the basic building block. And once you combine enough sounds together, we get a morpheme, where we actually have a unit of speech that has meaning. So, for example, a word would be a morpheme. Now, we talked about syntax and semantics, about how syntax refers to the rules of language, semantics refers to the meaning of language. So when you're studying a foreign language, a language that you're not familiar with, there's a lot to learn. It's not just the vocabulary. It's making sure that you understand the order that the words should go in, for example, making the sentences grammatically correct. And then also we talked a little bit about the stages of language development. So, for example, we talked about how during those first few months, children might have a little bit of receptive language where they're starting to understand where speech comes from. They're starting to understand that these words, they're made up of sounds, and they may start to recognize some patterns. And then as they get older, they'll start imitating and babbling, and they'll make sounds that sound like the language that is spoken to them. So babies are born with the ability to speak any language, but they will learn very quickly within the first year to make sounds that are similar to the language that is spoken to them, which is why it's very difficult to learn a language later, a foreign language that has different sounds. You just might feel like you can't wrap your tongue around some of the sounds of foreign languages. And then we talked about how, around the first birthday, maybe we have some single words coming in. Around the second birthday, we have longer sentences coming together. And then we talked specifically about the critical period for language, that a critical period says if you don't learn the skill by this point, you may never learn that skill. So this is not to say that the ideal time to learn language is by age 7. That's not what I'm saying. The necessary time to learn language is by age 7. It would be ideal for a child to learn language as soon as possible. However, if a child is in a terrible abuse, neglect situation where they're not exposed to language by age 7, they may never be able to really grasp language later in life. Now, if you learn one language by age 7, then it is possible that you can learn a second language, at least to a certain extent, but it's a lot easier if you learn it earlier. All right, and then our last lecture was on social development, so we talked about a few different theories of parts of our environment that impact us. Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory was that basically that onion that we peel back the layers. So we have the individual in the middle, and then they have a microsystem, the people closest to them, and then a mesosystem, which is the interaction between the components of their microsystem. And you have an exosystem, and so on and so forth. And so the great thing about Bronfenbrenner is that it does not focus only on the most obvious parts of your social world, like your parents or your teachers, but it also focuses on the bigger picture. Things like the media, culture, and even the time period that you were raised in are also important. And then we talked about Erickson. We said that Erickson looked similar to Piaget in a few ways. There were some specific stages that you progress through in order, and that it's generally tied to age, although as he got further down into those stages, he didn't give specific age ranges as much, things like early adulthood and middle adulthood that were a little bit more open for interpretation. But the basic idea was that Erickson says you have a challenge or a crisis that you face in each stage, and if you are able to be successful, then you gain resiliency to take with you to the next stage. However, if you struggle in a particular stage, then that will maybe set you up for a difficult time in future stages as well. Now, one of the issues with Erickson's theory is that these major challenges that you experience in each stage don't necessarily go away at the end of that stage. So we talked about how, for example, intimacy continues to be an issue. It's not just an issue during early adulthood. Identifying who you are, that's not just something that you stress over during adolescence. That's something that can come up again earlier or later in life. So Erickson's theory, once again, is a good rule of thumb, but we have to keep in mind that these life issues can come and go. And then we talked about Baumann's parenting styles. We talked specifically about how you have two main parenting components, what you do with discipline and structure and what you do with love and affection, and that you can combine those into 4 basic parenting styles. So neglectful parenting would be low on both structure and affection. Authoritarian parenting would be low on affection but high on structure. Permissive parenting would be low on structure but high on affection. I'll make sure I said this right. And then with authoritative parenting, you have high structure and discipline and high love and affection. So the best outcomes are correlationally associated with authoritative parenting. We see that those children tend to have better self-regulation skills, tend to perform better academically, tend to be better off psychologically. Whereas children, and this is all correlational, but children who've been exposed to permissive parenting are at increased risk for things like academic problems and substance use because they don't have as much self-control. Children who've been exposed to authoritarian parenting would be at increased risk for things like anxiety disorders or social issues because they haven't had a close, loving relationship. They've been more in a dictatorship kind of situation, which is stereotypically considered more popular in the South, to have that children should be seen and not heard kind of thing. And then with neglectful parenting, it's going to have pretty much a wide range of negative things here. So it's obviously the negative things about permissive parenting are still there because neglectful parenting doesn't have structure. but the negative things about authoritarian parenting can be there because neglectful parenting doesn't have love and affection. All right. A couple more things. We talked about ways that families are changing, about how because the divorce rate is about 50%, there are certainly a large number of children who are dealing with divorced parents, and about how then also there'll be more children exposed to blended families. So we said that the best way to have good outcomes here is to have all of the parents, all of the individuals in a child's life interacting with that child in an authoritative way, which could also include teachers and other caregivers as well, and to make sure that the children have high quality relationships with both parents, which can be tricky but is really helpful. We also talked about how parents are working. So, for example, moms are working outside of the home now more than ever before. Whether or not this is detrimental depends in part on the stress of the job. So a job that is very stressful, maybe has long hours, a lot of traumatic things involved or difficult things involved, makes it harder for a parent to interact with their child in an authoritative way. And then the last thing we talked about was Kohlberg's level of moral development, about how we learn from others, right and wrong. But we go through these different stages where in the beginning, in this pre-conventional phase, basically morality is made up of, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to be punished. I would like to get good things. So very young children may follow rules because they've learned that when they follow rules, things go well for them. They get rewarded. And when they break the rules, things don't go well for them. They get punished. And then as you get older and mature, there's not a specific age range on this. It's different for different people. But as you mature, then you move into a conventional stage where it's not about avoiding punishment or getting a reward. It's just about following the rules. But during a conventional stage, you're not following your own rules. You're following the rules that are given to you by other people. So the rules set by your parents, the rules set by your teachers, maybe the rules set by authority figures, law enforcement, legislation, that kind of thing. So your morality here is more mature in that it's not all about getting what you want, but it's still not fully mature in that it's not your own. You're still mimicking the rules and following the rules of other people. And then finally, when you reach that post-conventional stage, if a person does reach a post-conventional stage, at that point morality is tied to his or her own personal beliefs. So you make decisions for yourself about what you think is right and what you think is wrong, and those may be different from the people around you, may be different from your parents, may be different from culture, but you have your own personal sense of what is right and what is wrong. All right, that's been a brief review of the material for Exam 1. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me and let me know. Make sure that you do take Exam 1 while it's open. Be ready to take it all in one session once you open it. And I will talk to you guys when we start the material for Exam 2. Have a great day.